although it does that actually anyway, so it should be fun. So, my talk is about how World of Warcraft saved me and my education, really. And more specifically, it's about the fear of failure, and the fear of failure in our educational system. So, where does this all begin? When I was in the 7th grade, about 13 or so, I was getting ready for school one morning, and I was watching the news, BBC or something like this, and a report of a car bombing in Afghanistan came on. And there was a woman standing on the side of the scene, and she took out her cell phone and she was calling her son to make sure he was okay. And on the other side of the scene, there were a number of bodies, and one of them started to ring. And I very clearly remember this horrible moment of realization that that was her son. And naive 13-year-old me wanted to somehow help these poor, innocent people who were far, far away. So I set out to create an Innocent Victims of War International Memorial Day, which isn't a very catchy title. And I wrote up a speech. I marched into my 7th grade English teacher's office, Mr. Metcalf, and he remains one of the most inspiring people in my life because he listened and he wanted to help. Unfortunately, this is exactly the sort of thing that doesn't fit into our typical standardized structured school schedule, and my school couldn't really provide the framework to help. And ultimately the whole thing lost momentum and I failed. To 13-year-old me, this failure tore me apart a good bit, and I found myself with the somewhat poisonous mentality that if I couldn't fix what was around me, if I couldn't change the world, I was the problem, and I had to fix myself. And about a year later, I found myself in a hospital ward with severe anorexia nervosa. And this is not an uncommon or unique experience. National Institute of Mental Health reports that about 11% of youth experience a depressive disorder by the time we turn 18. 11%. And of course, on this scale, one of the greatest common denominators is school. My experience in the hospital, honestly, looking back on it, it's hard to say exactly what my feelings are. Fear is a pretty big one. Actually, the shame was the biggest until a couple of months ago, because it was such a failure. It was a failure of such magnitude in my head, but I couldn't imagine ever telling anyone about it. And it was really only with the help of a friend, Maria Mayor, that I came to the decision that the greater failure for me would be not to embrace this perceived failure. And I actually think Albus Dumbledore summarizes or encapsulates the experience best when he said, the part where he says happiness can be found even in the darkest of times, one need only remember to turn on the light. I found friendship in the hospital with people wildly different from myself. And I think being able to find friendship in a place like that was just enough to pull me back together a bit. And I got physically better, and I was released from the hospital about a month later. However, I was still struggling with very severe depression. And of course, the dark irony was that I was actually sort of relieved when I had left school to go to the hospital, not because of where I was going, but because I had left school. And I was not at all excited about the prospect of going back. So I also went somewhere else. I went to Azeroth, the world of Warcraft, a massively multiplayer online role-playing video game. And I joined a guild, Vanguard Gang. Actually, back then, we were called the Dragon Maw Vanguard. And I became a leader in this guild. I started leading 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, 50 people. And I found a family, this is one of our guild meetings, where my voice, my advice, my leadership, me, were all valued and encouraged and equal, even though I was one of the youngest members, by far still am one of the youngest members. And some of this confidence started to carry back over into my real life. And I started blogging with one of my fellow guild leaders. This is Ace the Druid, posing in his black boots there. And I started blogging with my biology teacher, Stacy Baker, and we were invited to NPR and then to the Science Online conference in North Carolina to talk about changing science education. And all of a sudden, I had a voice among real adults, not just like virtual adults. And I kept running with it, and I applied to be a page in the US House of Representatives. I played World of Warcraft right up until the night that I left for the job, much to my mom's dismay. And more recently, this past April, we threw Science Online Teen to give more students the opportunity to have an equal voice among scientists and educators about changing the future of science education. And you know, the greatest common denominator I've found through all of these experiences that I consider most valuable to my actual education is almost all of them happened outside of school. You know, with the exception of a few exceptional teachers, school at large operates counter to the interests of children. See, in school, we're not really taught to overcome a challenge. We're taught to fear the prospect of failure. We're taught on a virtue that says students have to learn you don't always get a second chance, especially with the rise of standardized testing. And of course, the lesson ingrained into our hearts and minds is that we don't deserve a second chance. Nothing could be a more problematic, damaging, misguided mentality to propagate to youth, yet we do so regularly. The only reason I have the opportunity to talk here in front of you from standing in a cold hospital shower is because I was lucky enough to find a second chance not in school, but in a virtual fantasy game with some of the most amazing people that I've ever not met. And you know, our school systems truly fear failure from top to bottom, from those in Congress who feel compelled to use standardized test scores to demonstrate progress for re-election, to our teachers and administrators whose jobs are more and more dependent on the results of those test scores, to us students whose entire future is at stake, buried under a pile of political, standardized, structured fear. How on earth can you innovate in a system that fears so much failure? You can't. And as a result, our educational method doesn't even lend itself to good learning. It certainly doesn't achieve mastery of the material, and it certainly doesn't create resilient, inspired students. It is impossible to innovate when an entire institution fears failure. It was Edison, it's cliche, but it was Edison who found 10,000 ways not to build a light bulb. 10,000 failures before he got one to flicker to life. That's what innovation looks like. That's what learning looks like. And I know somewhere else we can look for some inspiration. Azeroth. Actually, video games are incredible learning tools, and here's why. In all games, actually, one thing is certain. You will fail. Then you will learn from your failure, pick yourself up, and try again until you have mastered the challenge at hand. And imagine if our education system embraced failure for the sake of learning, for the sake of creating strong individuals who won't give up, for the sake of empowering and fostering the student. Imagine if we embraced the words of education reformers like John Dewey, who said, education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. Failure is a part of life. Failure is an integral part of learning.